Welcome everyone to this, The Work of Art, the sixth in a series of live discussions streamed across the internet and with a live audience. These take place under the auspices of the EU-funded smARTplaces project. Tonight, I'm speaking to you from Birmingham City University. My name is Paul Long. I'm a professor of Media and Cultural History and a researcher on the project. I'm part of the Birmingham Centre for Media and Cultural Research. Tonight's event is Craft, Enterprise and Gender in the Digital Age. And I'm pleased to be joined by my colleagues, Dr. Annette Nordin and Dr. Karen Patel, who will be speaking to this theme, telling us a little bit about their research and also why this matters in the context of the smARTplaces project. We're joined by an intimate audience in the Studio A at Birmingham City's Parkside building. And in getting underway, the first thing I'd like to say is thank you to the wonderful team of technicians who've made this possible this evening, who are looking after our live stream, but also to the management of the studio space. So without further ado, welcome everyone, and welcome to everyone who's online. We will have space to take some questions from people here in the studio, but also to those online via the auspices of my colleague Jerome Turner, who is also part of the smARTplaces project. Without further ado, let me introduce my colleagues, Annette Nordin and Karen Patel. Good evening.
Evening.
Annette, could I start by asking you to say something about the nature of your research and your contribution to the theme for this evening?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Annette Nordin. I work as a senior lecturer at Birmingham City University. And my research is about cultural entrepreneurship and cultural work. But within that, I'm particularly interested in the area of craft. One of the reasons for that is that because that's kind of in my background, really. I first studied textiles and set up as a craft maker, set up a small business. So as I came into academia and started to research creative and cultural work and self-employment, I've kind of come back to the idea of craft and self-employment in craft. I'm also now interested in place and how that relates to creative or cultural work. So looking at the cultural policies in particular places, thinking about where people work, co-working spaces, for example, and also thinking about the online spaces in which creative and craft work takes place.
For those watching online, I should just point out that the place we're speaking from is the UK's second city, which might be disputed by some, Birmingham, which is part of a major urban conurbation. And Annette's work has taken account of some of the ways in which co-working spaces and issues of enterprise take place in that space. Karen, tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you do.
Yep, so I'm Dr. Karen Patel. I'm a research fellow here at Birmingham City University in the School of Media, and I'm currently involved in a 2-year postdoctoral project funded by the AHRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council, and I'm working with Crafts Council UK, looking at diversity in the UK craft sector. And this leads on from my PhD, which I completed in 2017, in which I looked at how artists signalled expertise on social media. And during that project, I became interested in issues around inequalities, diversity in the creative industries, and wanted to focus in on the area of craft because of its associations with expertise, practical expertise in creation. So that's what I'm focusing on now. At the moment I'm interviewing women who are involved in craft, who are from a black and minority ethnic background, based all over the UK. So I'm interviewing them at the moment, and I'm also looking at their online presence and the sort of online spaces of craft, and the politics of race in particular has emerged as a real point of debate and interest.
Okay, well, part of this evening's discussion is to unpack some of the themes that you've spoken to in the context of your expertise, but also in the context of smARTplaces. And there are many who'll be watching who are already familiar with SMARTplaces, but who may be new to the subject. And SMARTplaces as a project brings together an amalgam of European partners, many of whom are institutions like museums, art galleries, who cover a range of practices, both the preservation of heritage, but also the curation and commissioning of new art and new types of cultural practice, from fine art to music to intangible events. And that leads me to ask you to answer a very simple, well, what may seem like a simple set of questions, but are crucial to understanding. First of all, in the context of that art world, could you say a little something about what the nature of craft is that you're referring to, but also unpack a little bit about what we mean by a craft worker and the degree to which there are issues around the nature of the work that they do. Karen, do you want to start with craft itself?
Yeah, so I get asked this a lot actually when people ask, well, what do you mean by craft? What sort of craft do you mean? Especially as a lot of the people that I've been speaking to had fine art degrees and have moved into craft, which is really interesting. But I've been working with the Crafts Council UK, who focus on handmade crafts, the type of crafts that involve materials that like textiles, ceramics, jewellery, woodwork, metalwork. So it's the idea of making, and Crafts Council refer to these people as makers, not craft workers or crafters, which is a term I was using at the beginning of the project, and they said no, we refer to them as makers. So for me, I've been working with that idea of material creation, of creating something, but there's a lot of ambiguity there with the sort of overlap between art and craft.
Well, I was wondering if Annette might pick this up, because the craft worker gets framed perhaps as someone quite distinct from the associations of the fine artist or even the creative worker, whether we're talking about the individuals who are making jewellery or within major institutions like a media company. The craft worker seems very different from the primary, or is treated, as if they're very different from the primary creatives in an organisation. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think it's as Karen has said, it's quite ambiguous how we use the term, and context, I suppose, is everything in trying to understand that. When we talk about craft now, also, we could be talking about craft beers. So it can really open up the discussion if we want to. And actually, sometimes that's appropriate, because there might be some practices within something like the craft beer movement that aren't that irrelevant to craft workers. But I think that's probably not what we're talking about today. I guess this space that Karen's in, working with the Crafts Council, is what we might loosely think of as professional and a kind of design-led craft space. Yeah. So having artisan skills isn't quite enough. The creativity and the design element is important. And there's certainly a sense that the individuals working with the Crafts Council, even if they're not full-time workers, are professional workers. Yeah. But again, in different contexts, we might think about that professional amateur worker. And in some subsectors of the crafts, we'll find that it's the amateur workers who are the most skilled. So in areas of embroidery, for example, there's many embroiderers guilds up and down the country in the UK. And there's some amazing skills that probably embroiderers today don't necessarily have, or contemporary young embroiderers don't have, or young people working in other aspects of textiles like patchwork, for example, or other kinds of textiles. So the professional skills can exist within the amateur space as much as it does within the kind of professional space. There is also an ambiguity between craft and art, I think, and there's particularly anybody who's studied a craft, who might be at the more artistic end of crafts and would want to sometimes see themselves as artists, producing one-off pieces, producing commissioned pieces, very much like an artist would. So it is tricky knowing exactly who we're talking about and what we're talking about when we're talking about crafts and crafts workers.
Well, if one thinks, you just brought to mind a number of things, I guess, there about craft and art and the treatment there. In this city, for instance, one finds tapestry and textiles in the art gallery treated as very individualised and high cultural artefacts, when of course much of what craft workers do falls outside of that kind of treatment. We're going to deal with amateur and professional to a degree, but I wondered, Karen, you've raised your own work with an institution like the UK Crafts Council, but just for the benefit of the audience and given our understanding of the creative cultural sector, is there a sense, you may not have a figure to hand, but I was just wondering about the degree to which we understand the craft area economically, or whether this is something that is still under investigation, compared, for instance, to how we, or rather policymakers, laud the importance of the gaming sector or, you know, media production or whatever.
Yeah, so the Crafts Council, with their research programme and their intention to inform policy, that is with the aim of making an economic case to the UK government for funding craft, for supporting craft. And a big part of this is demonstrating through their annual reports how much the craft economy provides to the wider number of the creative industries economy, and they've demonstrated that it's grown year on year. I can't think off the top of my head.
Don't worry, we don't
figure.
need although I think certainly from the European perspective, a sense of the size of the economy of production and also consumption might be quite important. But this does lead us on to the first substantive question, which is, or rather the theme to think about, which is whether the viewers, or this is certainly the case in my mind, what you're describing seems to me to be a very, would atomise be the right word, but an individualised area, clearly one in which there are value chains and connection. But I guess what I'd like to hear about is the nature of entrepreneurship, the individual as entrepreneur in this field, and the kind of challenges and opportunities that the craft worker has to negotiate. This has been part of your own research, Annette, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a degree to which I think the craft worker or the craft entrepreneur, even if they themselves don't recognise themselves in the title craft entrepreneur, but I suppose the self-employed craft worker who has to be entrepreneurial, there's a degree to which they have some of the similar challenges to other sectors in the creative industries. So perhaps it's interesting to think about, well, what's the more specific challenges that the craft entrepreneur would have? And you're right to suggest that there's a difference, because it is about the individual maker making their art or their craft products. So it's easy to characterise that as perhaps a lonely pursuit, perhaps quite passionate about the making process, but perhaps quite lonely in comparison to sectors like games and the film industry, for instance, where it's much more about teams and projects. But in my experience, it'd be interesting to hear what Karen has to say, but in my experience, craft workers do have individual studios, sometimes close to home, sometimes outside of home, but they really do connect up to others, either in their locality, so they simply know of others in the area who are involved in creative practices, usually others involved in crafts, or they connect up to associations and guilds, and they can be nationwide or across Europe or indeed international. So I think the kind of that offsets some of the kind of loneliness in craft entrepreneurship, that connecting others. That's also enriches their practice and enriches their entrepreneurial activities. So opportunities to do group exhibitions, opportunity to learn techniques to improve their practice of the practical aspects of their craft, as well as the exhibitions or sharing, selling kind of activities on and offline. So it's perhaps not quite the lonely artist in the way that we might imagine the craft worker to be. The entrepreneurial aspects of the work really differ across the subsectors within crafts. Of course, on the one hand, you might have people who are making quite large pieces, perhaps working in furniture, for example, which could require an awful lot of equipment. So the investment there is quite large, and sometimes people get together because of that, but certainly there are real challenges in getting going in the first place. And often that's where a relationship with perhaps where one studied can be useful. So access to some resources or access to some part-time teaching can kind of help people get their businesses started. But others can work from their kitchen table. In Birmingham, we have an area called the Jewellery Quarter, which is quite famous, and so we have a lot of designer maker jewellers. And if you're able to go around the Jewellery Quarter and knock on doors, and people sitting at their peg, they call it, the jeweller's peg, and you might have 5, 6 people within a studio working alongside each other, sharing tools, but also getting the benefit. And there are similar spaces in London, I believe in other parts of Europe, where there are other parts of the value chain who are there. So if you're a jeweller, for example, you might need a stone setter, or you might need somebody who does the polishing for you, and they'll be just around the corner or down the road. So that's quite common in craft practices, where you have, others in your trade around the corner working in a similar place, which is obviously valuable in terms of the entrepreneurial activities because it's more cost effective and you're getting better support.
Good. I'll ask Karen to make a contribution, but just to underline something you said, which I thought was quite important, although we're obviously speaking from Birmingham and our perspective as researchers in this area, you gestured towards the international connectivity of craft workers, let alone the fact that craft work takes place clearly at an international level. And I'll be interested to hear from those who are following us online from other parts of our partnership across Europe and perhaps further afield, whether they have a contribution to make or an observation about similarities or differences. And of course, we'll be picking up the online aspect of this, of craft, in a moment. But I wonder, Karen, if you've got any observations to make about the challenges and opportunities you've explored for craft workers as entrepreneurs, forging their own way, lonely or otherwise, perhaps, in a tough world. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because quite a few of the makers that I've spoken to, they're either black or Asian or of an ethnic background, and they've described themselves as introverts. So they like working by themselves and they like that solitary focusing on one thing. And I spoke to someone last week, and she said, my dream is to just have my own shed, my own studio at the bottom of my garden, so I can just go there whenever I want. I don't need to pay rent. Because that was a major thing that was coming up when I went to London a few weeks ago and spoke to some makers who were in studios down there, and rent increases were becoming a problem. But also, there is still something there with the lack of diversity of the craft sector and of craft spaces, where a couple of the women that I've spoken to have said, I came here and I looked around and I thought, this isn't for me. I'd feel uncomfortable here because they couldn't see another black person. And some of these studios are quite difficult to get into. You need to have quite an impressive portfolio, and a couple of them have had some help from the Prince's Trust, which provides funding for entrepreneurs to break into an industry, to start their own business. And a few of them, they've made their way into that space, and instantly felt uncomfortable. And I heard about these daily sort of microaggressions that they go through both online and offline, where they may not necessarily face any racism, but just certain questions, questioning their expertise, questioning the origin of what they made. Someone said she had a visit from some potential customers in an open studio and got asked, was this really made here or was this made abroad? So there's so many layers of judgment and microaggressions which make it especially difficult for women of colour to forge a career as an entrepreneur in craft. And this has recently come to light in the online space, where there's been emerging debates about racism in the knitting community, and it's really brought these issues to light and given them a presence and a voice online, which is important.
Just as a comment there, because I'm glad, I was going to push you, you've elaborated on the focus you have around people of colour and women in particular, and obviously gender is our major frame here. But the diversity issue you've just highlighted is an analogue of other issues across the creative and cultural sector, I guess. This is something that both of you have studied to a degree or researched, certainly locally. And that's something we hear, let alone the individualised area of craft. It's something we see replicated across other types of cultural work. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, we've done some work, collaborated on some work to do with women's sense of their expertise and how that's expressed online. And our focus for that particular research wasn't necessarily craftspeople, but I would say our joint and separate experience in researching craft workers would echo some of the findings from that there's I suppose you might call it that sense of imposter syndrome perhaps, or not wanting to show off too much online to demonstrate one's expertise in a particular area, whether that be as a craftsperson or indeed the entrepreneurial side to one's work, because those are two separate things as well as being two things together, two identities that merge and are seen sort of separately when we see how people talk about their work and talk about themselves as craft entrepreneurs. So there's real difficulties that are gendered in terms of positioning oneself as a craft entrepreneur.
Well, you're pushing us into that discussion where we want to go, which is to think about the online world, which again, picking up issues of opportunity and challenge. On one level, in theory, the online world offers anonymity, but presumably for any kind of creative, there's also value in demonstrating the authenticity of one's identity. I suppose there's a number of questions about entrepreneurship online, and one of the first things I wanted to ask about it, which is particularly prompted, I guess, you mentioned expertise, which is, with no disrespect to craft workers or any type of creative worker, the online world suggests a very low entry barrier to setting oneself up as any type of, making any claim that one's an expert. If I've got a Twitter account and said, I'm a furniture maker, photographer, author, whatever, I can do that. Is that what one finds? How do issues of expertise, identity and self-presentation and entrepreneurship, opportunities, challenges play out through the auspices of the online world?
So I looked in depth at expertise in my PhD, and I'm currently near the end of finishing a book about it. And
plug?
Yeah.
What's it going to be called?
Politics of Expertise, Culture, Labour and Inequalities by Roman and Littlefield, which should be out in spring 2020.
Okay. Summary?
So in that, I interviewed 18 cultural workers and I analysed their online presence using a signalling expertise framework that I developed from the work of Candace Jones. And it helped me to sort of analyse what people put online on social media to signal their expertise. And in the case of artists, this is a very short summary, but in the case of artists, I found that those who were most successful were confident in disclosing many aspects of their artistic process in detail, talking about it, expressing their aesthetic expertise, their aesthetic eye, their knowledge of those cultural codes and classifications, and being able to articulate that online, which is very difficult. And I do suggest that being able to do that on social media is a form of expertise in itself. So in terms of that, there was a whole spectrum. There were people who were very much still working it out, not very confident with using social media. So if you can signal your expertise, your credentials, your status, social media offers that platform to do that, but there are certain ways you can probably get found out by people who are judging your work.
Well, let me push you both on this in a very practical sense about using the online to promote and sell things. For instance, we're talking about quite a sophisticated idea there about a form of signalling, but the most obvious challenge, opportunity or risk, whatever, is presumably one can put work online and reach a bigger audience, a consumer base. You can, which must be difficult, I guess, if you're making individualised pieces, a piece of furniture or a tapestry or producing textiles. Is that the case?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's still a lot of crafts workers, makers, who are probably not that comfortable with the online space. But picking up on what Karen was talking about, I think it's also worth thinking about the online space, not as somewhere that just allows you to tell people about your work or sell your work, but it's much more about building a community. So I think that's where that sort of authenticity comes in, if you like.
Of fellow craft workers or consumers?
Of both together, and indeed your fellow craft workers could be your consumers. So I think it's much more of and your friends and family out there as well. So I think it's more of a community that is inclusive of kind of a range of different people. Your peers also, because I think there's a lot of friendship and support. And if I'm right, some of your research found that there was a lot of not only collaboration but just simply a supportive environment through social media spaces. So I think social media, it would be wrong to just think, oh, it's all about Etsy and selling something. I think it's also about, I'm trying out a new technique, or have a look at the changes I've made in my studio and here's some photos of it, or I'm just about to put these in my catalogue, or here's the ones I made last year, and here's this year's version of those earrings, for example. So I think that there's much more of a dialogue on social media, and it's much less of a kind of just a shop for selling your works.
Sorry to be a Luddite, but could you explain, because I don't really know it that well, but some people plugging in might not. What is Etsy?
I'll let Karen do that.
and I do know really, but if you could tell, I do obviously, but could you expand on the devices and mechanisms that are similar to that craft workers use?
Yep, so Etsy is an online shop where if you make something, or if you're an artist, you can basically have your own little online shop on Etsy and sell your work through that, and it's very popular. There's also a similar one, a UK-based one called Folksy, which I think a few people are going to, because Etsy's just become so saturated, and not only with makers, but with larger commercial companies coming in, taking up a lot of space. And I think the platforms that the people that I've spoken to use include Instagram, where it's very much image-based, and it lends itself to being able to show your work in a really nice light and connect with others as well, which, as Annette said, is really important, particularly for women, I think, because the women that I've spoken to, a lot of them, and I think women in general, we're just told not to shout about yourself too much, and there's this tendency to not brag too much, not blow your own trumpet, as I've heard. So that idea of sharing the work of other women, of collaborating, and of online communities is really important.
It strikes me, listening to the descriptions and thinking about what craft might mean when it's mediated online, is, other than the risks we associate with online culture, I presume, given the individuated nature of so much craft work, that there may be some IP issues and issues of competition about how you put out, you can display your individualism, your skill and capabilities, but at the same time you may be presenting to those who may be less than honest that your ideas are up for grabs. Is that
think
likely
it's
to happen?
sector by sector, depending on the work itself, that depends. I mean, because of it's sort of the opposite of what you're suggesting in a way, because craft work is so individualised. Often it will be quite difficult for somebody to copy effectively. So I guess there's a thin line between being inspired by somebody else's work and straightforward kind of copying. So you see a bit of both. I think I've talked to people who are very worried about showing too much, and in some sectors I think that's more of a problem, perhaps jewellery for instance, and in other sectors that concern just is hardly there. And again, it's also a little bit down to individuals too.
And I guess the other thing that struck me is and this goes back to, I guess, me just trying to think through some of the ways in which you describe the craft worker. One imagines the nature of the craft worker as being, like so much creative work, very labour intensive, devoted to producing, in some cases, very intensely designed pieces, sometimes other things that perhaps one can do more quickly, but no less individuated. Does the online world create situations where, if you like, counterintuitive to being a craft worker, intensifying demand, or exposing one to a need to up one's productivity, if you like, both an opportunity and a challenge or negative quality perhaps to being online?
I think it can do, definitely, because being able to post your work online and then deal with the comments, the maybe requests for payment or customers coming in, that adds to your working day. And with social media, it's very easy to just look at your phone and get caught up in dealing with requests, or maybe there's a problem that occurs, maybe there's not a very nice comment you want to deal with, maybe someone's copied your image and just taken it somewhere else. So there's all of those risks need to be dealt with, as well as what I mentioned before, with if you're a woman of colour, you're much more likely to receive online abuse than any other group. So there's that as well. But I have heard people that I've interviewed talk about the pace of making, which is slow and deliberate, is so cognitively at odds with the pace of social media that they have to have that separation between the two and set aside time for social media, because they just can't go between the two spaces very easily.
But presumably craft workers have had to deal with there's the being online, and then there's using online to be a seller, to be an administrator. That must have always been the case for craft workers who are entrepreneurs, if you like, in the management of their own sales womanship or salesmanship.
Yeah, and often that's done through events.
Such as, sorry?
So craft fairs or some kind of trade fair. So some craft workers work at the small batch production end, where they might be selling to a gallery or selling to a small independent shop, or indeed slightly larger, sometimes even department stores. And sometimes they're selling from their studio, from their website, or from their online activity directly. But we should also, in thinking about the picture that we're painting of the craft worker in their kind of everyday practice, There's the social media space they're dealing with that we're just talking about, and there's perhaps the studio space or wherever they're making work. But more of all the people that I've spoken to, it's certainly the case that they're out and about running workshops, often connected to schools or community groups and community centres, sometimes connected to exhibitions taking place in established large museums or unusual spaces. They're also producing commissions, so sometimes they're working with teams of people. It could include urban planners and architects. I've also come across quite a few craft makers who are involved as designers with fashion houses and other design teams, so the contribution they're making is particular to whatever skill they have and expertise that they can contribute to that project. So I think it would be wrong to imagine that they are there at their craft and possibly in their online spaces and not involved in a range of other activities, of course teaching also.
But again, even that description and thinking of the social media also makes me think of the burden that we know from creative labour, that there seems to be a demand to always be on, whether one's making or networking or promoting in person at craft events or simply being
absolutely
retweeting
and managing all of that
is
quite a task also. Bookings for workshops and how that's managed across the year. Some craft workers tend to be quite seasonal, so they might be preparing work for a Christmas period, for instance, or they're preparing work for a solo exhibition. And then how you manage everything else at the same time, because as an entrepreneurial person, as somebody who's self-employed, of course, you are a precarious worker. So if you've got a fantastic opportunity that's come your way, but you don't want to let go of the weekly workshops that you run, for example, or the monthly workshops. So all that balancing act is really tricky, but is all important income that you need, because, you asked before about the sort of sales and entrepreneurial element. We mustn't forget that this is not your best way to becoming rich. Being a crafts worker, we talked about the economy, the contribution to the economy, and the Crafts Council for a UK perspective have done a lot of research in this area, but certainly the income and the salaries that can be expected from craft work are relatively low and more often than not subsidised, at least with some kind of teaching or workshop activity.
Well, there's a further element, I wonder if you could speak to, both of you too, which I'm kind of prompted partly from what I know about Karen's work, but also thinking again about the gendered associations of craft work and the degree, forgive me for raising the term, but the association of the idea of the cottage industry, work that takes place in some relationship with the home or the domestic space. And I raise this because I know from Karen's work, for instance, part of the online world is either presenting the professional studio or sometimes indicating the relationship of the home with the studio or where work takes place. So I guess there's a question there about the degree to which gender plays a part in the precarity that the majority of craft workers, I take it to be women. Would that be the case? Or is that too general?
It's a higher proportion, but it's not the majority.
No, okay. Okay, so it is actually right. But we see more women in craft than other areas of creative work. Is that the case?
In part-time self-employed craft, yes.
Right.
But according to the Crafts Council's most recent figures, the majority of those in full-time secure craft employment are men, white men. Okay. So,
of course, that includes what the Crafts Council are counting.
Yeah.
But what do you mean by
there's a large community.
What do they mean by full-time employment? Employed by another rather than self-employed?
Employed by themselves, or?
No, it includes being employed in craft occupations in institutions, which could be media industries or other industries as well as craft.
It's actually, the data is difficult to read in a way, and it's difficult to pin down who isn't in the data.
Yeah, but the main thing to get from that is that the majority of those in precarious employment are women. And I think it's really interesting how the rise of Etsy as a platform has opened up opportunities for women to engage in self-enterprise in craft in a flexible way, so being able to fit it around maybe teaching or family responsibilities. I'm drawing a lot on the work of someone called Susan Luckman, who did a lot of research into Etsy and craft taking place in domestic spaces, craft entrepreneurship in particular, because craft has always taken place in the home. A lot of the women that I've spoken to, they like craft because their mums did it. Indian women, their mums would make all their clothes for them with beautiful embroidery, which takes a great deal of expertise. And yet, what I'm really interested in is that sort of form of expertise taking place in domestic spaces, because craft in the home is not considered a highly skilled form of creation compared to other types of craft.
Right.
Such as woodwork or metalwork. So again, there's gendered.
Okay, I want to turn to that point in the online, but I'm also conscious we've got a small but really well-behaved audience here who may want to jump in with a question. I was looking to Jerome to see whether we are picking up any input from online audiences. Could you? I don't want to sort of close that out, given that we have a limited time.
Yeah, Hester has made a comment about differences she sees between nationalities. So the idea that, so in her experience, Dutch people, for example, often finding handmade pieces too expensive, whereas British and American people really value handcrafted items. So she says, in her experience, pricing is one of the most difficult parts of the job. And I wonder if either of you have, based on that, come across, with the data or research that you've done or that others have done on how people set the pricing and how people square what they're going to price their work, whether they do that based on, what they think people will pay for it or what they think they should be recompensed for their time, essentially.
Should I try and answer that question? My experience is that people find it really difficult to price their work, and although organisations like the Crafts Council and other organisations help people who want to be professional artists, visual artists and craftspeople work out perhaps what a salary might look like for them, and then how that might then break down to an individual piece or to an hourly rate. All that kind of goes out the window when you start to love what you're making or love what you're doing, pour far more effort and energy into it, and then start to think about what seems like a reasonable price in relation to that. So on the one hand, I would say craftspeople are always underselling themselves more often than not. Having said that, I think there are some sophisticated methods that some at the very professional end and slightly more established makers are using, and that level of kind of craft work. The Crafts Council is involved in a selling exhibition called Collect, and that's collectibles, very expensive pieces. And I guess at that level, the work becomes inaccessible, as the question suggests, and certainly much more collectibles than something where you would see a small batch production of, or you'd be able to buy in a shop. But it's a really tricky balance, I think.
Okay. Anything else to us? Could you identify yourself when Jerome passes the microphone?
Hi there. Yes, I'm a regional policymaker. I've been talking to the Craft Council, looking at how we can help craft. We understand the actual space issue. We're looking at live workspaces. I wondered, how could we deal with policies that help address the agenda issues of feeling sort of undermined, being, of a different gender. So policymakers often need to know, well, what should we specifically do? And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on what we can specifically do.
This is your chance.
In terms of gender?
Yes, that may help us make the argument. You see, that might really help us. So we understand the issues about space, but is there something beyond space?
I wouldn't pretend to have all the answers. Perhaps Karen does.
Not yet.
But there are examples of good practice, so pointing to those might be useful. And certainly in a regional context, so I'm guessing that across Europe there might be similar kinds of spaces. But in terms of the region we're in and in Birmingham, I think that co-working spaces are doing a really good job for individuals wanting to come together, support each other, get access to resources, and actually that then works across genders or any other diversity. So, you know, providing resources of that kind, I think, is supportive to anyone and everyone. But you know, running workshops when there was a lot more European funding to support the creative industries in general, including the craft sectors, we would see programs, training programs, one-off workshops that would look at all the entrepreneurial side. And I think those have been missing for a number of years now. I know Karen's been running some workshops recently around social media, and I think they're exactly the kinds of things that are really supportive. I don't know if you want to say anything about those.
Yeah, so as part of a project last year, I did a free social media workshop for makers, and that was held at Steam House, which is a maker space, a co-working space in Birmingham. And they really valued the fact that it was free, and they came away with some practical things. Craft Space at the moment, they're a craft organisation in Birmingham. They've been running free craft workshops for local communities, particularly groups of women, of Muslim women in Birmingham, and they're free, and they've been able to create their own jewellery collections, which ended in an exhibition. Those are examples of schemes that give people confidence, help them to develop their skills. And that scheme also included a business session at the end. So having those accessible opportunities that people can easily reach, because that's a problem as well.
Do you mind, sorry, do you think the fact that it was women in your workshop made a difference? Did anybody suggest that in the workshop? Or?
I think it was on the back of an existing women's group that met every Tuesday called Dorsty Group, which means friendship. And it's a group of women that meet up every week in the local community for a cup of tea, or they might go for a walk. Because a lot of the women, they don't see their husbands, or they're widowed, or their kids have grown up, or all of the above. So it's a chance to get together and make friends, and I think Craft Space tapped into that existing group and provided the crafts classes.
Thank you. Good.
Okay. Anyone else from the audience? Any questions?
We'll carry on with our agenda if not,
I was going to say we have one other question that's come through on Facebook from Barbara. Do you think that phenomenons as design districts established in several cities are useful? What do you think about UNESCO design cities? Is that something you've got experience of?
I don't have experience of UNESCO design cities. I suppose in terms of design districts, we've got a lot of cultural quarters, creative quarters, and some of the co-working spaces that I've talked about would be in those kinds of spaces. So again, it does create an opportunity for people to come together, to be aware that they're not the only person making art or involved in a creative sector. I suppose what is useful there also is that it's not necessarily subsectors like the crafts or, in the case of Birmingham, our famous jewellery quarter and jewellers. There's a whole ecosystem around that, so whether it be photographers, architects, filmmakers, animators and so on. And I think that ecosystem is probably quite important to anyone working in the creative industries, whether it be crafts or any other sector. Having said that, I'm just starting some work with some colleagues in France and in Canada about creative quarters and cultural entrepreneurs. And one of the things that we're challenging at the moment is whether some creative quarters have become too successful for their own good, a little bit too expensive, a little bit too slick in a way. So I think some sectors of the creative sector want a kind of slightly more grassroots approach and want to look at slightly more alternative spaces. And I think that's probably some of the work you've just been describing about what Craft Space are doing. They're finding other spaces. So there's creative quarters can work, but they can be a little bit too slick, become a bit too expensive, and actually be quite challenging for sectors like crafts who, where you've got quite low earners, or if you're trying to engage or support members of the community that, don't have a lot of resources to put into a new venture. So it's a little bit of both needs to happen, but it's interesting to think of the grassroots activities that are taking place.
Sure, we have another question, Jerome. And then I'll have my final major question.
Hello, I'm Tony. I work in research, but in a more of a managerial side of things. I'm interested in craft, more from the point of view of traditional crafts, in the sense that Birmingham is a great example, known as the city of 1,000 trades. Many of them have died out. Is there any movement within craft industries generally to try to maintain and rebuild some of the traditional crafts?
I think that's, in terms of the sort of city of 1,000 trades, I think that refers to wider, larger scale manufacturing, which is, that's been on the decline. And I think what the Crafts Council want to do is to try and revive it, maybe, especially given that craft has become so popular recently. Everything seems to be associated with craft beer, craft pizza, everything. So this is a good time, I think, for the Crafts Council to try and grow craft, and I think it's happening, but it's on a smaller scale, and online opportunities as well have opened that up, but again on a smaller, more individualised scale, which we're still trying to find out more about and research.
But in terms of kind of traditional crafts, we're probably not talking about traditional crafts, we're talking more about kind of contemporary practices. But if you talk to the individual makers themselves, you'll find that they have really rich knowledge of the tradition that they come from and real expertise. So what you might see in an exhibition or in a shop or on Instagram could look quite contemporary and quite divorced from any tradition, but they themselves will often have skills, knowledge, expertise, and in their own way they'll acknowledge the many craftspeople that have gone before them. So they will have that reference point themselves, absolutely.
So to some degree the more traditional areas could be an inspiration?
Yes, yeah. And just part of the heritage, part of their history, if you like.
Yeah.
Just to observe, to connect up a couple of things from the question from Barbara and the question you posed, Tony. I think that when we look at policy and the identity of particular places, then the heritage of particular places, the association of particular, the very idea that there's a lineage of making, or whether it's craft or anything else, is often plugged into as if it has some hyperbolic idea of a DNA, even though it may be long gone. But the thing I just want to pull together, not to steer it away, but I think this emerged from some of the lines of reflection you've all been following, which was one of the questions I had in mind when we began, and it was signalled in something Annette's framed from the very beginning, which is the relationship of our themes around craft and gender, the online or offline, and the amateur and professional around craft. I was thinking when Karen was describing the groups that came together, on one level, that sounded like a very familiar type of arts participation project. It may not be. And I'm always interested in the way in which people feel that they are doing something rewarding for them, but also the degree to which that may actually allow them to realise their skills. Whether or not they end up selling or making a living is another matter. But it clearly plugs into how we understand the reputation or build the skills that individuals have in craft, how they promote themselves, the degree to which an individual may decide, you know what, I might be able to do this, not because they want to be rich, that doesn't seem to be entirely possible for all craft makers, but it might be to think about one of the ways in which we think about creative work. It may be because it offers more reward, spiritually, aesthetically, personally, than other types of work. So I guess what I'd like to speak to is thinking a little bit more about how these things play out in craft, and particularly, I suppose, about how an entrepreneur thinks of themselves as a professional, or whether amateurism is, maybe that's a choice that people pursue.
I think for the women I'd just spoken about who were working with Craft Space, for them, there are a lot of well-being benefits. So being able to immerse yourself in something that you're making, have the reward of developing your skills, developing confidence, to produce a tangible thing, to be in an exhibition that you can bring your friends and family to. Those are a series of opportunities that creative cultural workers do all the time and make a living out of it. And one of the main criticisms of the creative industries is how unequal it is, and how opportunities to make something of yourself in those industries are limited. So while this is not all of these women are going to go on and make thousands from their jewellery, they've enhanced their well-being, they've enhanced their friendship group, they've explored their creativity, found something they love that they might want to pursue later on. And sometimes that's fine, and it doesn't always have to end in making a lot of money. I think creativity and craft work and all types of creative work are really important for everyone to experience. Everyone should have the opportunity to at least, access materials to make polymer clay bracelets, to see if they're good at it or not, because they might be or they might not be. And these are opportunities that these women didn't have before. So I think opening up those opportunities is really important. The online space has played a bit of a part in the revival of craft as well, in that you can look at an online video and learn how to make something, and there are increased opportunities there. But I think it's important to not just think of it in purely economic terms.
Yeah, that sounds quite benign. Annette, a final word on that?
Well, it's really difficult, the amateur professional kind of space, Does it end up about participating, building friendships and so on, or does something end up what we might think of as more serious, although your well-being sounds like something serious to me. We see it across craft. I think craft is a good space to explore all those areas. It's a good space to investigate how they merge and blend and are difficult to separate out. As I said right at the beginning, some amateur craft practitioners are more expert and more skilled sometimes than professionals selling products or working in a similar area. So it's a challenge trying to think of the differences between them. It's also important to think that a craft practitioner, craft entrepreneur doesn't sit still. They don't produce the same thing for all their careers. So I've been talking recently to people who've had 25, 30 years as a craft maker, maker, and their practice as well as their entrepreneurship has changed dramatically over that period of time. So their own professionalism has not necessarily got better, but developed into new platforms, new areas of working, new kinds of collaborations, and new ways of thinking about the entrepreneurial aspects of their work.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks both for very rich insights. I'm conscious that while it's the longest day of the year, we were scheduled for about an hour, so I'll bring things to a close. I hope that people will pick up conversation online, whether it is around this edition of the Work of Art or think about the next edition, which will be led by our colleagues at ZKM in Karlsruhe, which takes place on the 21st of September, and that will be part of SMARTplaces' major event, You Are Art. Please follow us online to know more about that. And again, pick up the conversation at our Facebook page, through the hashtag The Work of Art, and of course do contact us directly. I'll thank you both again for your contribution. I thank BCU for hosting us, and in particular the team of technicians and producers who've made it possible today, and thanks for those who are here in person for joining us. Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you.